We thank Professor Glaeser. Just to move things along, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience, and there's going to be a microphone moving around right now. And I guess what I'll do is I'll get us started with a really quick question. And it might have been that I didn't quite hear this part, but I'm curious about your understanding of the relative significance of investing in infrastructure as opposed to investing in human capital. At least from the first part of the talk, my impression was that the general thrust was it's people, it's education, it's human capital, it's skills, as opposed to it's roads, it's railroads, it's people movers in Detroit and so on. And as you know, in the last couple of years, we've heard a lot about investing in infrastructure as actually a way of stimulating the economy. We've heard a lot about shovel-ready projects, right? We've heard a lot about, again, returning to that post-war investment in transportation and communication on an infrastructure level as a way forward. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So let me be reasonable on this, which is perhaps not my first instinct. I'm going to stand up, actually. The growing places do in fact need infrastructure, and my comments on restrictions on building in New York, I think hope I make it clear that when there's demand for space, it can be very costly to a city to not allow that to happen. And when you look at a place like Mumbai, does Mumbai need infrastructure? You bet. Mumbai needs a whole bunch of investing in sewers and roads and all sorts of things, which would have an enormous economic payoff. Does Detroit need new infrastructure? Emphatically not, right? And the view that the only reason anyone got the idea that a people mover would be a great benefit to Detroit is the federal government was ready to hand out money for transportation in those days and not for roads. Otherwise, it couldn't possibly occur to someone naturally that that would be a clever economic development strategy. And then the question is, where do we sit in the middle in places in the middle on this? I tend to think most good infrastructure can pay for itself. Right? If it's allowed to be, if it's really generating huge economic benefits, then in fact you can impose user fees and the darn thing will actually cover itself, as the Erie Canal did. Right? The Erie Canal was a large government project, but it pretty quickly, covered its costs in a few years. I am very wary about the view that America's big problem is our lack of infrastructure. I believe that it is infinitely more important for us to be investing in our children than investing in high-speed rail. And the economic payoffs from these projects are have rarely been shown. They are enormously expensive, great sinkholes. They're impossible to work as a short-term cyclical policy, right? Which I was very critical about this when it was originally rolled out. It is impossible to do infrastructure quickly and wisely. So its appropriateness for a job strategy during a recession is absolutely zero. Right? It is madness to try and think that you can actually, do a serious infrastructure project of some scale that, 2 years to get the environmental impact reviews done, right? Forget about actually putting stuff into the ground. I mean, how many years did it take for us to do the big dig in Boston? You can't time this stuff with a cycle, so you shouldn't be thinking about it as a job strategy. There are surely projects that need to be done, but I think your first instinct when a politician is selling infrastructure should be highly skeptical. Rather than lining up beyond it. Whereas when you hear a politician like the mayor talking about how vital it is to invest in our children, that's where I would put my money. Is the investments in people. For surely America's comparative, the strength of the American economy in 2050. I'm again parroting the mayor on this. Will depend on the knowledge that is in our children's heads. It will not depend on our ability to get goods around marginally more cheaply than the Chinese will.
Other questions? There's a hand in the back there.
I thank you very much for an entertaining talk. And I wondered if you could talk about governance and the governance of cities. You touched on it when talking about laissez-faire or not. And I just wondered, looking forward in the future of the city, are there innovations in terms of governance that the history points to? We're on the verge of an election here. Is democracy going to fare well? Singapore is a great city, but it's not democratic. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I wouldn't draw too many inferences about the benefits of dictatorship from Singapore, right? You have a draw, and once in a while you get a Lee Kuan Yew, and then, otherwise you can, you can also get, some of the most terrific people in the world end up in dictatorship. So I certainly will take the messy middle of democracy over dictatorship on any day in terms of on average. Even China, it's going to take a lot of good years to make up for, great leap forwards and cultural revolutions. Again, I think over the long haul, India, for all its flaws, offered better governance, although I find it odd that I'm, given the issues with Indian government, I find it odd that I'm saying that. But it killed far fewer of its own people. In terms of city governments, again, I'm going to, there obviously are a lot of interesting initiatives about things like public-private partnerships and various forms of experimentation along those lines. And I think that's great. It's great to be experimenting along these different ways. I think charter schools are great. It's great to be thinking about particularly in areas where we think the public sector is not working well. It's great to be innovating along these lines. Within a city, there's sort of an optimal amount of democracy as well. There are cities that have huge amounts of checks on the chief executive, that we think of as having lots of community control, lots of ability of localities to say no to new projects. And then there are cities like Chicago that have fewer checks on the chief executive, right? Where the chief executive is in fact stronger. My own reading of the track record of history is that it's pretty easy to get too much democracy in cities, that actually there's a lot to be said in urban areas for having a strong executive who's actually able to get things done. And one of the reasons why we fear that less at the city level than we do at the nation level is that by and large mayors don't have their own armies. They're not actually allowed to start a war with Detroit if they think it would add to their popularity, unlike national leaders. And of course people can always leave, right? That's the other natural check on this. But certainly there's a great line of Teddy Roosevelt that's in the book, which is something like, I consider the doctrine of separation of powers to be among the most pernicious ideas come up by man, right? And this is a guy whose attempts to reform New York City's police department was very much stymied by the fact that there was a Tammany guy on the board with him who could basically veto anything that he did. In terms of things that I care about a lot, like, say, for example, building, right, or schools, right? It's very, very easy for small dedicated constituencies to block reform. And I think one of the great advantages of having a strong central figure is that figure can then weigh things off, and ultimately he's accountable in a way no more specialized official can possibly be.
There's another hand over here. Oh, here we go.
Thank you. So I resonate with your comment about poverty, with respect to, we shouldn't assume that cities should be as homogeneous as suburbs. And I think many of us are attracted to live in cities because of the diversity, racially, ethnically, socioeconomically, et cetera. I think, though, the most provocative thing you said is that, if I understood you correctly, we shouldn't be ashamed of poverty in a city, and to some degree, poverty is not indicative necessarily that a city is doing something wrong. And I guess I'm just interested to hear you to kind of push that a little bit further to understand, what does it mean for a city to own its poverty? What is the value of poverty to a city? What does it mean? Is it possible to be poor yet to be educated and to have good health? I just want to understand your comment a little bit more.
Sure. No, I'm happy to talk about that. And let me be entirely clear. On poverty and inequality. In no sense was I saying that sort of national, it was right for national governments to, embrace inequality in any stretch of the imagination. But ultimately, nations, at least in a world in which you don't have free migration across national borders, nations do in fact, bear fundamental responsibility for all of their citizens. They actually are in some sense making them, right? They're creating the economic conditions. They're responsible for the education system and so on. Whereas cities are very fluid things, right? I mean, Fifth American changes homes every couple of years, and people are choosing their cities, and as a result, I think it's wrong to be ashamed of the fact that you have provided a more attractive place for people at the, lower end of the human capital distribution than, some cozy suburb where you have to pay $1 million to buy in, right? I mean, that's something, in fact, that we should be, proud of, that our cities are able to do this. That isn't meant to suggest complacency towards providing the city services that these people need in any stretch of the imagination, but it means that you should never sit there and say, well, New York or Chicago is terrible because of the poverty. You should be saying, well, thank goodness we're actually able to provide a space for these people, provide economic opportunity for them, provide a way forward for them. So, I mean, that's really my point on this. And I certainly believe that cities have an enormous responsibility for the children that are growing up in their areas. I mean, if poverty is not just if poverty becomes a way of life across multiple generations, it's a big problem. I mean, that's not the mayor should be perfectly happy every time a poor person comes into the city, but they should be unhappy with every child who goes through the city's school systems and ends up staying in poverty, right? Those are the two competing things, and you certainly want to be okay with the migration, but not about the education component of that. So I hope that clarifies at least a bit of what I'm saying. I also think it's important, I mean, cities don't thrive if they're 90% poor. I mean, obviously you need a mix on this stuff, but that's the I think I would hope at least that would go without saying.
We're going to take one last quick question.
Thanks. That was a very informative historical tour for all of us. I have a question building on your assumption that we can't afford to build all the infrastructure we might like. Chicago is as guilty as any other place in not maintaining what we've got and in not exploring some of these new tools you talked about, like pricing. So public opinion and, just kind of from an economic perspective, what do you think we're missing? What are cities missing to squeeze more value and efficiency out of the infrastructure that we've got?
Right. So I certainly think
water,
pricing,
transportation, everything.
No, I think this is exactly right. So I think there are two issues. One of which is building new stuff is endlessly exciting for everyone, right? And maintaining old stuff seems very old hat. And this has created a bias as long as I've never known a city government, I've never known a state government that doesn't suffer from the desire to, roll out some exciting new high-speed rail initiative that's going to do something new, rather than saying, well, we're going to really focus on the potholes in LA, but the potholes in LA actually have a huge value to fix relative to the dollar spent. So that's one problem. I mean, the second problem is just the politics of congestion pricing are awful. I mean, it's just a very, very tough thing. And one of the great virtues of being, an academic who has no intention of ever serving in any official public capacity whatsoever, is that I'm allowed to say things. In fact, I would argue that those academics who dabble in public affairs almost have a duty to say things that are outside the mainstream, in the hopes that in the long run we actually change things to make it more palatable. And certainly, congestion pricing is an old idea. It happens to be a good idea. I think the only way that happens is on new roads, actually. I think the key is that sort of any time you put in new roads, you need to push very strongly for user fees that actually cover that. And that's one of the reasons why I worry about a big federal push to pay for stuff, is that it pushes you exactly in the opposite direction of trying to actually get the users to actually pay for the infrastructure that they're taking advantage of. But transportation is in fact really important. I don't want to move away from that. But I think too often we've sort of rushed blindly into big spending projects that were poorly thought out. And one of the reasons for that is that we have some Washington paycheck for all this thing, which is totally unconnected to whether or not it's actually delivering value for the users on the ground. And that's one of the reasons to really focus on user fees, is you actually can make sure that the thing is actually generating enough value that it makes any sense. I mean, I would love just for high-speed rail to have a rule that 50% of its costs, or just 50%, need to be covered by riders. Right? That would be, that would seem like a bare minimum of what you'd actually ask for from any of these projects, rather than the sort of 10% or so on that you get in terms of the projection. So I think actually offering to pay 90% of high-speed rail from the federal government is working in exactly the wrong direction in terms of providing the connection between customer value and the infrastructure. So let me stop then.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank Professor Glaeser for an extremely stimulating talk.